Announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include materials on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to discuss the importance of voting rights for all Americans across this country. With less than 50 days before Americans go to the polls to elect our next president and other elected officials, we are still faced with the harsh reality that this will be the first election in 50 years Americans will not have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Today's special order hour is on behalf of the House Democratic Outreach and Engagement Task Force. I want to thank Assistant Leader Clyburn for his leadership on the task force and all of the members of the task force as we work together to make sure that we engage all Americans in the importance of voting. In fact, one of the first things the task force did was to host a series of voting rights forums across this nation to put together a report that shows modern-day barriers to voting still exist. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed not only by legislation, but, Mr. Speaker, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed with the blood, sweat, and tears of so many Americans. In fact, all of us know of the courageous sacrifices of our very own John Lewis. But there were so many known and unknown foot soldiers that made it possible for America to live up to its ideals of democracy and justice for all. As a daughter of Selma, Alabama, I am painfully aware that the injustices suffered on the Edmund Pettus Bridge 50 years ago have not been fully vindicated. Although we no longer are required to count how many marbles are in a jar or recite how many counties there are in the state of Alabama. My proposition to you, Mr. Speaker, is that there still exists modern-day barriers to voting. Those barriers may not be as overt as they were 50 years ago, but, Mr. Speaker, they are no less stained. They're no less as important as those other barriers were. I have seen example after example as representative of Alabama's 7th Congressional District of the modern-day barriers that exist to voting. Since the Supreme Court struck down critical parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the Shelby versus Holder decision, so many Americans have taken to the floor, mostly Democrats, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, urging our Republican colleagues to work with us to restore the essential protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Several of my Democratic colleagues, including myself, have hosted voting rights forums across this country to highlight the continued need for restoring the Voting Rights Act. Members have also introduced legislation. I, for one, am quite proud of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, a bill that I sponsored along with several of my members of the House, including Representative Sanchez and Representative Chu. Our bill, H.R. 2867, has over 187 sponsors, Mr. Speaker. It actually answers the Supreme Court's challenge to come up with a modern-day formula by which to have pre-clearance provisions in the Voting Rights Act. I think it's so important, Mr. Speaker, and I know that so many will agree, that we make sure that we find these pernicious examples of restraining people's rights to vote on the front end. Because after all, Mr. Speaker, once the elections have happened, you can't unring that bell. So the beauty of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was that it allowed preemptive efforts to stop discrimination in voting. Therefore, any changes in voting practices in the covered states had to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department or by the D.C. Court of Appeals. This was quite important, and I have to tell you, The Shelby decision did was it struck down that key provision, Section 4, which gave the covered states and provided the formula by which we knew which states would be covered. So therefore, in the Shelby decision, the Supreme Court really issued a challenge to Congress to come up with a modern-day formula. You know, it was the Supreme Court who said that we can't punish states like Alabama, the state from which I hail, and other southern states for what happened 50 years ago. Congress must come up with a modern-day formula that talks about current efforts to restrict the right to vote. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what we've done in the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015. I want you to know that of the 187 sponsors we currently have, not one Republican has signed on. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a sad day in the House of Representatives when voting rights becomes a partisan issue. Voting rights is an American issue. It is neither red nor blue, but rather it is what our founding fathers fought for, drafted, and ensured that all Americans have a right, a fundamental right, to exercise that right to vote. After all, the integrity of our democracy depends upon every eligible voter being able to vote. Most recently, I was privileged to also join with my colleagues and my fellow House member, Representative Mark Vesey of Texas and Representative Bobby Scott of Virginia, and other members of Congress to launch the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus. The caucus is committed to restoring the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to its original state and restoring the vote to all suppressed voices in this nation. I want to commend my fellow colleagues, Representative and Scott, for their visionary leadership in starting this caucus. I'm honored to be a co-chair of the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus, and we will take as our charge to make sure that we fully restore all the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In spite of these continued efforts, Mr. Speaker, it is disheartening to see that state after state, including my own state, after the Shelby decision, instituted photo ID laws, voter restrictive photo ID laws. So many of my colleagues may say, well, what's so restrictive about requiring a photo ID? After all, you need a photo ID in order to get on a plane or to get your passport. But I say to all of my colleagues who question the restrictive nature of photo IDs that not all Americans fly. Not all Americans have a passport. But all Americans who are eligible have the fundamental right to vote. And we, the elected representatives on behalf of these Americans, must not impede that most fundamental right. We should be looking at ways that we can encourage voting, not discourage voting. After all, the fundamental foundation of our democracy is the right to vote. So I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that it is quite important that we in this House do what so many of our predecessors have done and restore full protections on the right to vote. You know, I wish I were alive when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. But I can tell you that there was no more fundamental, seminal pieces of legislation that passed this omniscious House than the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Rights Act of 1965 are still some of the most seminal pieces of legislation that this body has ever passed. And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, how can we today, 50 years since the passage, 53 years to be exact, how can we stand on the cusp of electing another president and, for the first time in those 50 years, not have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act? It is indeed a sad day. But I know that this body will and should do the people's work. And the people's work is to allow all Americans who qualify, who have registered to vote, who turned 18, these Americans have the right to vote. You know, I would love it if this body would pass an automatic voter registration bill. I've signed on to such